I've been thinking, are the older DPSs and Wuthering Waves struggling to keep up now? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So, there's a couple of reasons that I've thought of this. First of all, I do think that obviously, as we all know, 2.x DPS characters are a whole lot stronger than 1.x DPS characters, but that hasn't really mattered up until this point, because all old DPSs can clear. This still remains the point, however, I don't think playing them is as comfortable as they used to be, namely 2 units being Jian and Shangli Yao. So, in what ways would they be struggling exactly, and is there a remedy for this? In Jian's case, he used to be one of the de facto best in slot picks for Whimpering Wastes. That's because whenever the mode released, it was mostly focused around AoE mobbing, and most of the enemies there were trash mobs. The main focus of the game mode was never to do as much damage as possible as fast as you can like TOA, but rather, it was about dealing sustained damage over time that was highly effective in an AoE range, and Jian absolutely excelled at that, which was delightful considering how old of a unit he is. However, since Whimpering Wastes has went up a lot in terms of HP, he's having a harder time clearing the way he used to. In fact, he's actually not even that good in the game mode anymore. Obviously, you can still force him to work, but he's definitely not as strong as he once was, which is a shame, but it does make me wonder if older DPSs are starting to lose their luster a little bit. Now, when I say that, I obviously know that these main DPS characters are still fully capable of clearing, but they're just not as good as they used to be. Like, yes, they were never exactly the strongest option, 2.x units have generally been better on the whole, but it's getting to a point where it's becoming a lot harder to clear with these characters. Before, I would say that Jian was a very recommendable pull to basically anybody that was looking to clear Whimpering Wastes easily, because he shared a similar positive quality to Camellia, that being, he was amazing in both TOA and Whimpering Wastes. So whenever you pulled for him, you were basically getting a double deal, getting a character that was able to sort out both of your resetting endgame modes and do so beautifully. Because his damage amount in TOA was more than enough, and in wuwa, it was fantastic how well he could group enemies. That made him a very nice pull. However, I would say that because he's fallen off in wuwa, so too has his pull value. He's still a good DPS, you can still definitely make him work, but it's undeniable that his hypercarry damage numbers are starting to fall off a little bit nowadays, which is why it's really nice when good teammates for him, such as the upcoming Yuno and of course Shakona, are able to provide some solid sub-DPS for him. Sub-DPS actually becomes very relevant for this character, because he's generally just not that strong on his own. I still think he's one of the most well-designed characters in Wuthering Waves, beautifulness-wise. I really like his design, but kit-wise, it is true that he does leave a lot to be desired these days. Obviously, I'm not saying he can't clear. I know he can definitely clear. I mean, I would definitely know. I use him to clear myself. I really like the character. However, he definitely feels weaker, and I think this is undeniable, especially because we do have better arrow DPSs these days, such as Cardathea for example, and even DPS Yuno is going to be a thing whenever she drops. So we have other options. Jian's not really the only one anymore. So there's just not really that much of an incentive to get him in particular. It's a bit unfortunate, and obviously people are still going to get him if they like him, which absolutely go for it. I like him a lot too, but I would say he's fallen off a decent amount. Shangli Yao's downfall, I would say, has been pretty evident in this last while, mostly because Augusta's release really highlighted his issues. That being, while he was definitely a sound DPS, he just wasn't really that good compared to most other DPSs in general. Not even just 2.x, he's just one of the weaker picks that you can pick up. He's always been a brilliant quick-swap character, of course, so his own hypercarry damage not being that good honestly wasn't that bad because high chance was, if you really cared about his max damage dealing, you were probably playing him with Changli anyways. But if you preferred a more casual experience, then you probably used Hyper with Yinlin, and that also worked out just fine. He's always been serviceable, easy to play, and generally speaking, just a pretty good DPS all around. However, he's just so unremarkable these days. He is cool for being able to slow down enemies, and that actually does help out a lot in Kalcharo Quickswap, because it means he's able to get out his death messengers far more comfortably without any sort of interruption. However, how many of you are actually playing Shangli Yao Kalcharo Quickswap? Unless you just really think Virgil Roth is super cool, which is based by the way, but you get the idea. I would say that he's just kind of fallen into this position of kind of being a niche DPS. You only really use him if you got him for free, back whenever he was free, and I would say that we've gotten so many new players since then, so that number of people is honestly not as high as you might initially think. Sure, there's definitely an initial batch of people who have him, but even those people I would expect to have better DPSs at this point. And in terms of Electro DPSs, Augusta absolutely annihilates him in that field. She is so much better in basically every single way, if not just her damage. So unless you're the biggest Shang Li Now fan ever, he definitely does feel like a bit of a weaker DPS these days, and certainly one of the more replaceable ones. If you've invested a lot into him, I can understand not dropping him because he is still good, and that's the thing with Wuthering Waves. No matter how far these DPSs fall, there's usually some way to save them, or some way to keep them relevant. But I do think it's great that Kuro eventually realized we needed more Electro DPS options. We really did. Because, honestly, while Shang Liao did cover for Electro for the time being, he just wasn't worth picking up if you didn't have him for free. He just really wasn't, and investing into him more just kind of felt like a waste, because he just isn't on the level of most 2.x releases. We really needed that boosted up Electro character that can kind of live up to modern standards, a character that would actually feel worth investing in, and that just isn't Shang Li. So I do think that those two DPSs, who are quite old, have fallen off. As for Jinshi, it's an interesting case, because I think her damage isn't even that bad. She's still a pretty solid DPS, she just doesn't really fit into Whimpering Wastes. I would say the falloff is pretty evident from when she was literally the strongest character in the game, but to be honest, I feel like that's kind of quote-unquote cheating. Like, yeah, of course, the previous best character in the game is no longer the best character in the game, but I don't really think it's fair to say that that's some catastrophic fall-off because she was once really good, remained being quite freaking good for a while, and then eventually just kind of petered out and isn't really worth the pull as much these days anymore. Yeah, you don't really have much of a reason to get her over other DPSs, I would say. And my main reason for saying this is wuwa. You just can't really make her work that well there. I'm sure if you're an absolute god gamer, and you could somehow make Jinshi Changli Quickswap work, which is a ridiculously high skill team that very few people can actually pull off and make work, then it's just not worth using her in wuwa. And then in Camelia's case, she's still a pretty solid DPS, but in terms of Havoc units, Frolova's just so much better, and where Camellia was amazing in wuwa, Frolova absolutely owns the game mode. She is so unfathomably good there, it is kind of next to ridiculous. But then this all begs the question, so, have older DPSs really fallen off? Are they struggling to keep up? Is it really an issue? Okay, so, I would say that it's an interesting case, because I don't necessarily think that pulling for any of these DPSs bricks your account. It's more that you have to be willing to commit to them more. I feel like before you could get away with running cheaper teams or worse echoes and get by just fine. But I do think you need to be more willing to invest into that character and put time into them over a couple of months if you want to keep them sustained over time. It can happen. A character like Gion, who came out in 1.0, continues to get new teammates to this day. He's never going to truly fall off as long as Kuro continues to pay attention to these older units. And I do think that for the most part, they've done a very good job at looking at older DPSs and making sure that they're still capable of clearing content. Also, even if it's maybe somewhat cope, there's always the side towers of TOA. Those are literally never as hard as the middle tower. It's the middle one that ends up being the big boy that you really want a big team for. And we are getting some new tower floors, of course. So more well-built teams are going to be wanted. However, there's always going to be easier content where you can use your weaker DPSs. And as you play this game for a longer amount of time, you're eventually going to have a roster that's big enough to tackle basically any situation. And these older characters are still very much good units in their own right if you're able to play them and play to their best strengths. I'd say the issue here is mostly Whimpering Wastes. When it was just TOA, I feel like most of these characters would still be considered quite strong. Maybe not completely because their damage has fallen off and I feel like TOA is very much on a damage basis. But I do think part of the issue here, at least in my opinion, is that wuwa just doesn't really suit some of these characters' playstyles. Jinshi's backloaded nuke playstyle is the most anti-wuwa thing ever. And because of the HP inflation and the fact that there's not really large wave clear anymore, she's just even worse there now and it's just not really worth using her there unless you're really good. I will say that's the nice thing with Wuthering Waves. If you're really skilled at the game, you can make anything work. There are people taking Verena, Sanhua, and Yohu of all people, yes, Yohu, giving them electric crit echoes, putting them on the Plunderer's token, and clearing Whimpering Wastes just for abusing their intro and outro skills. That is an actual thing people are doing and getting ridiculously high scores. It's hilarious. So at the end of the day, with enough mechanical knowledge, you can surpass basically any challenge and cheese anything in the game. This is the nice thing about it being so skill-based. Things only end up being problems if you're just not willing to learn, but if you're willing to learn, basically everything can be compensated for. However, if you're more of a casual, I would say sticking to the 2.x releases is probably your best bet, and the nice thing is that they have aged well. I would say that Carlotta is still a very good DPS even now, and that's the thing. I will say that these old units, 1.0 units, are still clearing and are still viable. I think that is still worthy of some credit. But what do you think? Let me know down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hopefully this video was able to tell you whether older DPSs are struggling to keep up or not. This has been Juice, signing out. And I cannot wait to main DPS Choyuen regardless of whatever his kit ends up being.